She stood on the observation deck of the newly opened Addis Ababa light rail, watching the gleaming trains glide silently through a city that seemed to be rebuilding itself in fast forward. Dr. Aisha Kone, an economic development specialist who had spent her career studying African markets, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about economic growth trajectories. The data in her briefcase told an impossible story. Ethiopia, a country most of the world still associated with famine images from the 1980s, had achieved something that development economists called mathematically improbable. For the past 2 decades, it had sustained economic growth rates that exceeded China's miracle years. Not once, not occasionally, consistently. Between 2004 and 2019, Ethiopia's economy expanded at an average rate of 10.8% annually. To put this in perspective, during China's most celebrated growth period from 1980 to 2010, the average was 9%. Yet while China's transformation became the defining economic story of the late 20th century, Ethiopia's extraordinary acceleration remained virtually invisible to the global conversation about development. This invisibility was not accidental. It challenged fundamental assumptions about how economies develop, who can achieve rapid growth, and what the prerequisites for modernization actually are. Ethiopia's success story didn't fit the existing narrative frameworks that the world used to understand economic progress, the impossible mathematics. Dr. Kone had learned to distrust simple explanations for complex phenomena, but Ethiopia's growth trajectory defied even sophisticated analysis. The country had achieved sustained double-digit growth while starting from one of the lowest bases in human development history. In 2000, Ethiopia's GDP per capita was $120. By 2019, it had reached over $850, a 7-fold increase in less than 2 decades. But the raw numbers only told part of the story. What made Ethiopia's transformation genuinely mysterious was how it had been accomplished without following any of the standard development playbooks that international institutions had prescribed for African nations. Ethiopia had not liberalized its financial markets. It had not privatized state-owned enterprises on schedule. It had not opened its capital account to foreign investment flows. It had not embraced the Washington Consensus recipe that supposedly unlocked prosperity. Instead, it had pursued what development economists awkwardly labeled heterodox policies, a diplomatic way of saying approaches that didn't conform to Western economic orthodoxy. The Ethiopian government had maintained tight control over key sectors of the economy, while selectively opening others. It had invested heavily in infrastructure, using state-directed development banks rather than relying on private capital markets. It had pursued industrial policy, the practice of government actively promoting specific industries, which mainstream economists had declared obsolete in the 1980s. Most mysteriously of all, it had achieved this transformation while remaining largely isolated from the global financial system that was supposed to be essential for modern economic development. The visibility problem. Standing in the heart of Addis Ababa's construction boom, Dr. Kone reflected on why Ethiopia's story remained so unknown. She had spent years presenting Ethiopia's growth data at international development conferences, only to watch audiences receive the information with puzzled skepticism rather than curiosity about what lessons could be learned. The problem, she had come to understand, was not just about data or economic analysis. It was about narrative frameworks and the deeply embedded assumptions that shaped how the global community interpreted African experiences. When China achieved rapid growth, The world marveled at an ancient civilization reclaiming its historic position. When South Korea or Taiwan succeeded, they became models of how countries could climb the development ladder. But when African countries achieved similar or even superior growth rates, they were typically explained away as temporary commodity booms, statistical anomalies, or unsustainable bubbles waiting to burst. This differential treatment reflected what Dr. Kone had come to recognize as a fundamental bias in how development was conceptualized. The implicit assumption was that rapid, sustained economic growth was something that happened despite being African, not because of distinctive African approaches to development challenges. Ethiopia's growth couldn't be dismissed as a resource boom. Unlike Nigeria's oil-driven expansion or Botswana's diamond wealth, Ethiopia's economy was built on agriculture, light manufacturing, and services. It was the kind of diversified, labor-intensive growth that development textbooks claimed was the ideal path to sustainable prosperity. Yet somehow, this textbook success story remained largely invisible in global discussions about economic development models and best practices. The infrastructure revolution, walking through the Bole, Lami industrial zone on the outskirts of Addis Ababa, Dr. Kone witnessed the physical manifestation of Ethiopia's development strategy. Massive Chinese-built factories employed thousands of Ethiopian workers producing textiles for global brands. But what struck her was not just the scale of the operation, but the sophisticated infrastructure that made it possible. The industrial zone was connected to Ethiopia's new standard gauge railway linking Addis Ababa to the port of Djibouti. Modern telecommunications networks provided high-speed internet connectivity. Reliable electrical power fed the manufacturing operations. Clean water and waste management systems supported both industrial and residential needs. This infrastructure had not emerged through market mechanisms or private investment. It was the product of a comprehensive, state-led development strategy that coordinated investments across multiple sectors to create the foundation for industrial growth. The Ethiopian government had borrowed heavily to finance this infrastructure expansion, often from Chinese development banks rather than Western financial institutions. Critics labeled this approach unsustainable debt accumulation, but Dr. Kone noted that the same critics had previously argued that lack of infrastructure was the primary constraint preventing African economic development. Ethiopia had called their bluff, building the infrastructure first and generating the economic growth to service the debt later. The strategy had worked, but it challenged conventional wisdom about debt sustainability and development sequencing. The agriculture transformation, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ethiopia's development, was how it had managed to transform its agricultural sector while achieving rapid industrialization. Most development models assumed that countries had to choose between agricultural development and industrial growth, moving workers from farms to factories as economies modernized. Ethiopia had found a different path. Through targeted investments in agricultural extension services, improved seed varieties, and rural infrastructure, it had increased agricultural productivity while simultaneously expanding manufacturing employment. Rural incomes rose as industrial jobs multiplied, creating domestic demand that fueled further growth. Dr. Kone had studied this agricultural transformation extensively, recognizing it as perhaps the most significant anti-poverty achievement of the 21st century. Between 2000 and 2016, the percentage of Ethiopians living in extreme poverty fell from 56% to 24% in one of its own, the fastest poverty reduction rates ever recorded. Yet this achievement received minimal international attention, overshadowed by concerns about political governance and human rights issues that dominated Western media coverage of Ethiopia. The political economy paradox, the disconnect between Ethiopia's economic achievements and its international reputation, highlighted a deeper tension in how development was evaluated and understood. Western development organizations typically insisted that economic growth was impossible without political liberalization, press freedom, and democratic governance structures. Ethiopia had achieved extraordinary economic results while maintaining tight political control and limiting civil society space. This created an uncomfortable paradox for development theorists who had built their careers arguing that political freedom was a prerequisite for sustained economic growth. Rather than reconsidering these assumptions, the international community tended to treat Ethiopia as an anomaly, a temporary deviation from the natural relationship between political and economic development that would eventually revert to the expected pattern. Dr. Cohn found this response intellectually dishonest. If the goal of development was improving human welfare, reducing poverty, and expanding economic opportunities, then Ethiopia's approach had been extraordinarily successful. Dismissing these achievements because they didn't conform to preferred political models seemed to prioritize ideological consistency over practical results. The regional multiplication effect. What made Ethiopia's growth story even more significant was how it had begun to transform the entire Horn of Africa region. Ethiopian construction companies were building infrastructure projects across neighboring countries. Ethiopian Airlines had become Africa's largest and most successful carrier, connecting the continent to global markets in ways that had never existed before. The industrial zones around Addis Ababa had attracted not just Chinese investment, but also Turkish, Indian, and European manufacturing operations looking for competitive production platforms with access to African and Middle Eastern markets. Dr. Cohn recognized this as a classic example of how growth could be contagious, creating positive spillovers that benefited entire regions. But rather than celebrating this African-led development success, international media coverage focused primarily on political tensions and conflict risks, the measurement blind spot. Standing in the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, Dr. Cohn reflected on why Ethiopia's transformation remained so poorly understood by the international development community. Part of the problem was methodological. The tools used to measure and evaluate development success were designed around Western experiences and assumptions. Traditional development metrics emphasized formal sector employment, regulated financial systems, and measured democratic participation. Ethiopia's growth was driven largely by informal sector expansion, state-directed investment, and collective decision-making processes that didn't register on standard governance indicators. By conventional measurements, Ethiopia looked like a poorly governed, economically risky country with limited development potential. By results-based measurements, poverty reduction, infrastructure development, industrial growth, educational expansion, it looked like one of the most successful development stories in modern history. The disconnect between measurement frameworks and actual outcomes revealed how supposedly objective development analysis was shaped by cultural assumptions about what successful development should look like. The replication question. The question that haunted Dr. Cohn was whether Ethiopia's approach could be replicated across Africa or whether it represented a unique set of circumstances that couldn't be generalized into broader lessons for development policy. Ethiopia's success had been built on several distinctive factors: a strong state capacity inherited from its imperial history, a large domestic market that could support industrial development, and geographic advantages that made it a natural hub for East African trade. But Dr. Cohn suspected that the most important factor was something less tangible: a development strategy that was designed by Ethiopians for Ethiopian conditions, rather than adapted from external models and donor preferences. This suggested that successful African development might require abandoning the search for universal development models and instead embracing the kind of institutional experimentation and policy innovation that Ethiopia had pursued. The narrative war. The more Dr. Cohn studied Ethiopia's transformation, the more she understood that the invisibility of African growth stories was not accidental. It reflected a broader struggle over how development was understood and who had the authority to define success. Acknowledging Ethiopia's achievements would require admitting that African countries could find their own paths to prosperity without following Western blueprints. It would suggest that state-led development strategies could be more effective than market-led approaches under certain conditions. It would imply that political and economic development might not follow the linear progression that Western development theory assumed. These implications were uncomfortable for international development institutions whose expertise and legitimacy were built on the assumption that they understood the universal principles of economic progress. The future trajectory. Looking out over the construction cranes and new buildings that dotted Addis Ababa's skyline, Dr. Kone tried to imagine what Ethiopia might look like in another 20 years if current growth trajectories continued. The country was on track to reach middle-income status within the next decade, a transformation that would affect over 20 million people and demonstrate that rapid development was possible, even in countries that started from extremely low development bases. But Ethiopia's experience also raised difficult questions about the trade-offs involved in rapid development. Environmental degradation, income inequality, and social tensions had accompanied the economic expansion. The sustainability of debt-financed infrastructure development remained uncertain. Most importantly, the political model that had enabled rapid growth was showing signs of strain, as rising education levels and urban employment created new demands for political participation and civil liberties. The recognition gap, the central mystery that Dr. Cohn grappled with, was why Ethiopia's remarkable development achievements remained so poorly recognized and understood by the global community that claimed to care about African development. She had concluded that the problem was not lack of information or inadequate data. The statistics documenting Ethiopia's transformation were readily available and had been verified by multiple international organizations. The problem was conceptual. Ethiopia's success didn't fit the categories and frameworks that the international development community used to understand economic progress. Rather than adjusting these frameworks to accommodate Ethiopian realities, the tendency was to treat Ethiopia as an exceptional case that didn't challenge broader assumptions about development processes. This intellectual inflexibility had real consequences. It meant that the lessons from Ethiopia's experience were not being incorporated into development strategies for other African countries. It meant that international support for African-designed development approaches remained limited. It meant that the remarkable transformation taking place across multiple African countries remained largely invisible to global audiences. The broader pattern. As Dr. Cohn's research expanded beyond Ethiopia, she began to recognize that the invisibility of Ethiopian growth was part of a broader pattern of how African development successes were systematically overlooked or minimized. Ghana had achieved sustained democratic governance and economic growth over 2 decades, but received minimal international attention. Rwanda had built one of the most efficient and least corrupt governments in Africa while achieving rapid poverty reduction, but was criticized for political restrictions rather than celebrated for development achievements. Botswana had sustained one of the longest periods of rapid growth in modern history while maintaining democratic institutions, but was treated as an exception rather than a model. The patterns suggested that the problem was not specific to Ethiopia, but reflected systematic biases in how African experiences were interpreted and valued by international observers. The alternative framework is standing once again on the light rail platform in Addis Ababa, watching commuters head to jobs in industries that hadn't existed 20 years earlier. Dr. Kone reflected on what Ethiopian development revealed about the possibilities for African economic transformation. Ethiopia's experience suggested that rapid, sustained development was possible for African countries if they were willing to experiment with approaches that might not conform to international best practice guidelines. It demonstrated that state-led development strategies could be highly effective under appropriate conditions. It showed that countries could achieve remarkable progress even while facing significant governance challenges. Most importantly, it proved that the capacity for economic innovation and institutional creativity was not limited to countries with particular cultural backgrounds or historical experiences. The question was whether the international community was prepared to recognize these achievements and incorporate their lessons into how development challenges were understood and addressed, or whether the commitment to existing frameworks and assumptions was too strong to accommodate uncomfortable evidence about what actually worked in practice. Dr. Cohn suspected that the answer to that question would determine not just how Ethiopia's story was remembered, but whether other African countries would have the space and support to pursue their own innovative approaches to development challenges. The growth miracle that nobody talked about might be the beginning of a broader transformation in how development happened, but only if the world was willing to pay attention to what was actually occurring, rather than what theories predicted should occur.